Hello, friends. Welcome to Coding Garden. Welcome to a very special episode. Today, we are going to be celebrating the launch of Feathers version 5, and we have a guest. So please welcome David, who is the creator and core maintainer of Feathers.js. David, if you'd like to give a quick intro of yourself.
Yes, hi everybody. Thank you, CJ, for having me. We did this for version 4, so I'm really glad after all this work in a couple of years to be able to do this again. My name is David. I live in Vancouver, Canada on the West Coast. And for the past 10 years now, I've been working on something called Feathers.js. I'm going to probably give a quick intro of that as well. You can also see I sometimes like to make music, and I've been wandering around a lot in the mountains in British Columbia lately. So if you want to talk about hiking, music, or coding, hit me up. I think today we're going to do some coding because, as I always say, nothing ever goes wrong when you write some code.
Definitely. And so, like David said, it's going to be pretty casual today. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. And we're just going to be doing some live coding. So David's going to walk us through what Feathers is, what's new in V5, and we're going to build an app with it. So any questions you have, please throw them in the chat. Sounds good? All great? Yes, I can. Awesome. Okay, I think we're ready to jump into it then, if you'd like to.
Excellent. So yes, if there are questions, we're going to look at questions at the end. I think we're going to first have to start with what Feathers is, what it does, and some of the live coding I want to do is just showing off some of the basics. I always like building an app from scratch to show how everything fits together. Feathers does have a CLI, so we might look into that a little bit as well. And hopefully we'll have some time to look at how to make it all work with React as well, because there's some interesting new features that make that really nice. So let's take a step back first, though. Feathers is a framework, a web framework for Node, but it also works in the browser and in React Native. You can use it with TypeScript and JavaScript. I think some of the biggest new features are related to a TypeScript integration. Feathers has been around for about 10 years now, so it's seen a lot of change and progress in the web development space. What I always liked about it was that the basic concepts that I'm going to go into a little bit held up really well, even through the tumultuous 10 years. And some of the new features that version 5 has fit in really well with everything else. So I'm pretty excited about showing those off. And I think that would be the basic intro for it. The interesting thing about Feathers is that it was always a drop-in replacement for Express. So if you used Express before, you could just replace your Express app with your Feathers app and use all the middleware, and then just start using the Feathers features. And one of the big ones, so one is you can create web APIs with it that are REST APIs. But it also, the way you build your application also always, ever since the beginning, automatically gave you real-time updates. So if you connect instead of REST HTTP with a WebSocket like Socket.io, you got updates from the server as well. So you could still use the API and create messages and delete messages, but you could also then get notified about new messages. And this is how Feathers does the real-time thing. And that's why a lot of the examples are usually chat examples, because it makes for a really good demo. So if you look on the website into the guide, you can actually see the chat being built in the guide. And I think I'm going to start with a quick start from scratch, just because I would like to show that the CLI generates an app with a lot of useful tools and a lot of functionality, but that you can still get started right from scratch. Are there any questions we should probably answer right now?
Let's see. So Akibet has asked, was V5 a complete rewrite of Feathers.js?
Pretty much. So this is a good question. The problem with TypeScript is that it's, especially when it's a developer facing framework, and it has grown organically from JavaScript. It's almost impossible to create up-to-date types that always work properly with everything. So basically everything in V5 has been rewritten in TypeScript because it's always easy to go from TypeScript to JavaScript. So if you go into the docs, you can see that you can actually still choose the language and it'll give you the JavaScript code. But all the course modules and the application is written in TypeScript and then just compiled on the fly to JavaScript if you want to use JavaScript. So yes, a lot of it is a complete rewrite.
Oscar asks, how compatible is Feathers with Express? I think you sort of touched on that.
It is. So this is interesting because it is a fully compatible drop-in still, and it also has a Koa adapter now, which is the one that we're recommending just because it's a little more modern. And you could also integrate other frameworks. And the interesting thing about this is that you usually don't have to worry about, if you really build the app the Feathers way, you don't have to worry about the framework that you're using underneath too much. It's just providing the transport for you, but Feathers is doing all the work that you would need to do in creating a custom middleware, and it does all the boilerplate for you. That's kind of the idea behind it. So a lot of people that have used Feathers for a while realized, and it's the same for me, that I didn't end up using any Express or Koa middleware anymore at all because everything could be done in the Feathers.
Yeah,
and the Feathers functionality.
I have that exact same experience. So Ross asks the question, how safe is it for production? Is it better to wait a while? I guess they might be asking about V5 specifically, but if I could just give some personal anecdotes. I have at least 4 apps written in Feathers that are in production. One of the apps I built was think of it like a digital walk-in clinic. So it's like a web page where anybody could go to, and they basically get in line to have a one-on-one with a nurse. So I built that app with Feathers. Like the real-time aspect just worked, right? Because you need real time of people coming into the room and like, are the nurses available and what are the office hours and stuff like that. So I use Feathers for that. I also use Feathers for an app that was almost like just like a bespoke Google Maps. So there was one community in Florida that wanted to have a catalog of all of the social services in the city and different stuff like that. And so we built the app with the backend on Feathers, and we actually really didn't even use the real-time piece of it. Just the fact that you get like CRUD for free and all of that is one of the main reasons we used it. And that app is still in production. This chat that you're seeing here on both sides, that has a Feathers backend because that actually takes the chat from Twitch IRC and then spits it out over WebSockets on Feathers. So Feathers is definitely production ready. I guess more so they might be asking like version 5. Can that be used in production yet, or what are you thinking?
So this is always an interesting question because the development has been going on for the last year and a half, and ever since the first pre-release, people started testing it out, which was fantastic. And the tricky part with production readiness often is you don't know until it's used in production. So we've had quite a few people that are using version 5 in some pretty big applications already, but there's also always questions coming in from new people that are using it and things that could be done better or things that just nobody else used that way before that are causing problems. I feel like we've always been pretty good in fixing bugs pretty immediately, especially for new releases. So there's an analysis tool for open source code, and it said most bugs are fixed within 48 hours, which I didn't even realize. So please try it. And the best way to make things production ready is for people to use it in production. So I'm excited just to see what everybody's doing also with what you said, CJ, or the project that you're using. It's always really nice to see all the great things that people are building on top of it.
Yeah.
It's pretty exciting.
So I definitely want to get into some code, but I think it's going to help a lot of people maybe understand what Feathers actually is, because Ross also has the question, what are your main competitors? I know in the guide, isn't there a section, or maybe in the help, there's a section on what, like, compared to like Firebase and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, so this is always an interesting question because some of the approach of Feathers is pretty unique. The whole service approach is different than what most frameworks like Fastify and Express and Koa and Nest.js are doing. It doesn't use controllers or middleware. It uses services to define your CRUD methods. And that is what allows Feathers to just provide your API in whichever way you need, either as a real-time API or as a REST API. So it is similar to most web frameworks, but the concept behind it and the architecture and how you build your things are a little different, and it takes some getting used to. One of the big things that people wanted was custom methods in services. So we'll talk about this in a little bit. The basic services are just CRUD functionality, so you can find and get and create and update and remove. But sometimes you want to do something else. So the CRUD functionality handles 90% of all the things that you need to do. I mean, it's what computers do. You can put data in them and get data out and change it. So, but sometimes you want to also use specific custom methods, and that's one of the new features in the new version. And the comparison is tricky also because we now have more tight integrations with the database. So before, people build services for databases, and you got a CRUD endpoint pretty much with one command. And what we ended up doing now with some of the new features and to just make the integration a little more tight was to include SQL and MongoDB by default in core. So all the other adapters still work. We have a new cool ecosystem page where you can actually look at all the plugins that Feathers has, and there's a section for databases as well. And what the database adapters do is they basically provide the service functionality that you would have to write yourself, but with the standard CRUD methods already implemented. So you get that with like one step. So it provides a little bit more structure and architecture on top of Express and Core, of a lot of the minimalist frameworks. But because everything is very decoupled, you can also just use a different plugin or a different tool that is more useful for you. I hope that answered the question.
I think it's good. I can give my perspective on it too. So, and I guess really the main point here is if you're already building APIs with Express or Fastify or Koa, you could be using Feathers and kind of just get a lot out of the box that you wouldn't have to write from scratch. And like from my personal experience, that's kind of how I saw and found Feathers, because I was already building Express APIs, and then I found Feathers. And like David was mentioning, it's very customizable. So like the idea of hooks is a very powerful thing, and it basically makes it so that like you're not trapped or stuck with how Feathers does things. You can break out of it with hooks. You can make custom services. So in my experience with Feathers, it's like it's really good at like doing everything for you if you need it to, but it's also really good at like getting out of the way if you want to write really custom code. So yeah, I think we should get into code. I think we have a lot of questions, but I think we got to show people the code.
Yeah.
And then we'll come back for all the questions at the end, I think.
Yeah, let's write some code.
Let's do it.
Okay. So my idea here was I would like to go a little bit in what the CLI does in a little bit, because it generates a lot of the things that you need for a real app, like authentication and database and all of those things. But I also like the idea of showing that it's still possible and easy to get started from scratch, and starting from scratch always makes it easier to understand the core concepts, I think. So I'm going to write this in TypeScript, and like I said, nothing ever goes wrong if I try to write code. And also I have Copilot on, so it's going to just mess with everything even more. But the first thing, so we're going to write this in TypeScript. the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to create a message app. So we need a message type, right? So we need a text, and my message also has an ID, that's a number. And then we write the service. The service is basically supposed to store our messages and let us create new ones. So Copilot already learned all the things that I did, but let's quickly look into this. So it's a TypeScript or JavaScript class. A service can also be an object, and the service methods are basically get, find, create, update for complete update, patch for a partial update, and remove for removing data. So you have those methods that you can implement with whatever you want. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to store a couple messages in memory, right? So we have a message list here, and when somebody calls find, then we return all of them. And when we create a new message, we create like generate an ID, because we can't delete messages. We're just going to use the message array length. I want to be able to maybe create more of this. So I'm going to just put this entire array in, or this entire object, and then we just return it here. So this is kind of our basic Feathers service, which does have nothing to do with Feathers. It's just a class that has a couple methods. All right, and then
just real quick request from the chat. Can we hide the terminal until we need it, just so we can see more of the code?
Oh yes, absolutely. Cool. That is a great idea. Thank you. All right, so then I want to create my service types, which is basically our endpoints, right? So our endpoint, we want to reach at messages, and it's a message service. And we'll pass this here. Oh, generics. This is always fun. We don't need too many generics, but it was a lot of fun making this all generic friendly in TypeScript from a library developer's perspective. There's some crazy TypeScript foo in there. All right, so we have our Feathers app, and the app is that object that contains all the services, and it's similar to the Express app, right? So if you've used Express before or Core, this app.use might look familiar, but like in Express, where you register a middleware, we're just registering our messages service. And what Feathers does is basically the service is the same object that we defined up here, but it adds some additional functionality to it so that you can listen to events and things like that, which we're going to actually do right now. So we create a main function because we can't do async stuff at the top level. I'm going to call it before I forget it. And
can I pause you really quick?
Yes.
We just got raided. Thank you very much to Jay Linksdorf for the raid, and welcome in, raiders. David is in the middle of doing some live code, so I'll hand it back over to him. But definitely go check out Learn with Jason. He has a really great stream. Jason just brought over 40 viewers for us.
Excellent. Welcome, everybody. I hope we just started. We created a message service class. So that's kind of what we did.
And a quick rundown. So Feathers is David is the creator and core maintainer of Feathers.js. So he's kind of giving us a rundown of what Feathers gives us.
Perfect. All right. So we registered our messages service, and I can get the message service with the Feathers functionality if I call app.service messages. And then you can see like I have the find and create already here, but it also has a couple of other things. And one of the important ones that gives us all the real-time functionality is being able to listen to messages or to changes. So if I call message service.create, it will automatically send a created event. So now you can imagine that if I wanted to have a chat on the client, I could just listen to this event as well and update everybody who's looking at the chat. Now we're just going to log it to the console.
Hey, one thing I want to point out really quick is there is no Feathers code until line 31. So it's like you get a really good idea of like basically just by defining a class that has a couple of methods on it, you give it to Feathers, and now Feathers instantly turns it into an API. I guess we haven't shown it yet, but you have sockets, you've got REST. I guess you could add the REST adapter, but yeah, I just wanted to point that out. Sorry.
Yeah, we're gonna do that in a second. But I like that idea that you said. There's a lot of, so Feathers always tries to stay pretty low level with the libraries it integrates, even with some of the new features for the schema definitions and things like that. You use the library that does this. There's no abstraction. We learned the hard way that whenever you put an abstraction on top of a great library, you're doing yourself a disservice, because then you have to kind of duplicate and create your own strangeness with it. So Feathers always tries to stay as low level to the libraries that are being used, while still adding the structure on top of it that you can build your API.
Yeah.
So the thing that I was going to do here is basically, this is all going to just log to the console. So one of the things that's important is that Feathers works in the browser as well. So all of this is not just Feathers specific. It's also works in Node and Deno and React Native, Bun, in like every JavaScript platform. This you can use, and which is interesting because Feathers doesn't specifically have. It has a really nice client integration, because you basically use Feathers on the client, and instead of creating a service that does this, stores it in memory, or talks to a database directly, you just talk to the service on the server. But we're going to go into that in a second. Let's just create a message. So we basically say app here. Boom, there we go. Thank you, Copilot. This is actually what kind of makes it nice. I've done this a couple of times, and now it kind of knows what I kind of want to do. So this is kind of basically, here we're creating a new message just with the text, right, which just calls this method here. And then we are returning all messages. Now I'm going to remember, and please remind me to keep the console hidden when we're not using it, but right now we need it. So now I can just run this file, and you can see, I hope this is big enough, but I think so. You can see, okay, this comes from this event handler here. And this log is basically all the messages, which is just an array. Now we can talk about APIs, because this works in the browser. It works in Node. It just logs some stuff to the console. Why are we talking about APIs, right? And this is where the framework integrations come in. So one of the new integrations, the framework integrations and the protocol that you're using are basically just plugins in Feathers. So one of the new ones that we added is Koa. Koa is very similar to Express. It just has a different middleware pattern, and it's a little more minimalist in a lot of ways. So let's use that. Use the Feathers Koa integration to turn this message service into an API. And all we have to do is basically wrap this whole thing, wrap our app into Koa. So now it's like a Koa application. So you can use Koa middleware now. So you can say that app.use error handler, for example. We always need an error handler so that we get JSON errors back. And another one that's important is the body parser to parse bodies. And then we just register our message service. So these 3 lines we need to turn the thing that we just wrote into an API. So down here, we'll just keep everything the way it is. And then we just say await app.listen 3030. And then right. So let's try that. So now we're listening on localhost 3030. What happens if you go there directly is we'll probably get an error because there is nothing happening here. But if you go, so if you remember, we registered our service on the messages endpoint, right? So if you go to messages, we get another error, which is unfortunate. See, this is what happens when you write code. Things go wrong.
No worries.
Let's quickly look at, this is what I usually do anyway. We can look at the actual example because you know what I forgot? So we didn't actually register our REST plugin, which my apologies. So this is like I said, nothing ever goes wrong if you write code, even with a lot of smart
It's okay.
co-pilots and everything watching you.
Yeah, we're very used to it here. I get stuff wrong all the time, but that's the point.
Right? Yeah, no. I mean, part of it is like actually figuring out the debugging steps too. All right. So, but what we forgot is to actually register our REST handler. So of course it's not going to work. So if I go to localhost 3030/messages now, it'll work.
Nice.
Now let's do it with some syntax highlighting because that usually always works better. Now we also can create new messages. So if I go into this one, what we did here, right, is create a create endpoint with data that's a message, and I can just send a post request to this endpoint now. And I will get a response that shows that, we created a new message with ID number 1 and this text that says, hello, everybody. If you look at the console, you can also see that this created handler is logging it, which is neat because that's how you can do server-side updates and logging and all of those things. And if I go back to our browser, we'll also see that it showed up here. Questions? We'll go to the next step.
Yeah, let's just jump into the chat. So from what you've seen so far, do you have any questions about that? We'll definitely get to like the higher level questions and like the more meta questions in a bit, but of what you've seen, is there anything you have questions about? Do you have endpoint validation? I think we're going to show that with hooks, very likely.
Oh, I'm excited. Yes, this is an excellent question.
Yeah, because I mean, you see the code that we've written. The post endpoint just takes anything in and puts it into the array. But of course, you want to be able to validate it. So yes, Feathers can definitely do that. Terawatt says, "Why would you abstract so many things?" So Terawatt is the resident troll, but I think with all of these abstractions, I think you see how powerful all of this is. Because actually, I did see a message in the chat earlier that was about, are you going to add something like that Prisma has where it can do like model introspection? And I think the beauty of Feathers is you don't need to. You just use the library that's good at it and then integrate it. So
yeah, so the abstraction part is a good question. I think abstractions are important if it is on a low level. If that makes sense. So the idea behind Feathers was from my university research, where I tried to find an abstraction that works for any language. So this is not JavaScript specific. This service interface with those methods, right? I know I wrote a research paper about like an interface, but it turned out to be really powerful. And that's also what the web was built behind. This is how our REST APIs and all of those things work. Like I said earlier, this is what computers do. And what was cool in combination with Node, it came out around the time when I finished my paper, was that the real-time kind of aspect of it just fit in. So the abstractions of Feathers core itself, even with TypeScript, I think is the whole core framework. So the whole thing that we're loading here is like 300 lines of code. So that's how I look at like a valuable abstraction. It shouldn't abstract code for you. It should just make sure that you never have to write it in the first place. So in this case, the whole boilerplate of creating all the middleware and all of those things, you don't have to because you just implement your service.
Yeah. Codex had a question. So what's use versus configure? Shouldn't use be a thunk that returns middleware so you can query configuration? I think it's possible that like, the term's being reused, but I guess if you want to point at the code, like the...
So the difference with that's exactly the point with use. There's a compatibility problem because use basically gives us, you can register the service on a path or you can register middleware. And the configure it's kind of like a really old leftover from Express 3, and then they removed it because they wanted to use. But in Feathers, we need this because we also have other transports integrated that are not middleware. So Feathers needs to have an ability to just hook into the entire application structure. So it's a special Feather specific keyword. It basically is used to create plugins, and the generator also uses configure to compose your application. So instead of like complicated dependency injection, you just use app.configure, and then you can combine your application from different files and with a good structure. Great. Let's look at hooks. So we already had a question of how do you do validation? And one way would be to just go in here and validate it right here. But one of the concepts on top of Feathers that we found super powerful and super useful, because I don't always want to change my service. What if I want to log the user that sent the message? What if I want to send an email when a new message has been created, right? I don't always want to get into my actual service method and mess with the code and it become this like really long ball of mud that does all those things. So the thing that Feathers has on top of services is hooks, which is essentially Feathers' idea of middleware. In fact, it is exactly like Koa middleware. It's using the same, just did the same code for it. And how you register this is basically you grab your service and call hooks, and then you can say, I want to do something before, after, or on error. And a new feature in version 5 is also around, which I'm going to maybe go into in a little bit. But let's just go into before and say like, okay, before create, I want to do something. So the do something is I'm creating a async function that gets a context. And what the context has, it's basically has the app object, it has the data, it has an ID. So if you wanted to create like let's look at this. If you wanted to do something like messages find one, right? Implement a get, you do something like, we'll implement this in a second. Oops. Other way around. We'll implement this in a second, but in now the context has an ID. So this is basically just our execution context. And what we can do here, if we say, I'm creating a new message, but I also want to know, want to log what time it was created at on the servers. So you can just say context data. We'll need to add it to the types. TypeScript is great, but it makes things more verbose, and sometimes you forget to add things to the type. But let's just say I created at, which is a number, because I like working with timestamps way more than with actual date objects. It's saved me a lot of pain to use timestamps instead of date objects, by the way. If anybody ever runs into that, if you can, use timestamps and then convert it on the front end if you need to show an actual date. But on the back end, it's always good to deal with numbers. You will run otherwise. The date handling is not fun. And this saves a lot of that pain. All right. Anyway, let's do created at date.now.
Yeah, add really quick. I mean, you may not have noticed it, but the types have flown through. So context.data actually has the type of message. And so I haven't used V5 extensively yet. I've only used V4, and I didn't actually use it with TypeScript. But the fact that the types are flowing through like that is actually pretty sweet.
And this is one of the bigger, this is where the rewrite really made a big difference, because you could just have an end-to-end flow for all of those things. One of the things, the exclamation mark here is still, it could be possibly undefined because we don't know for sure if somebody just passed nothing. But what we can do now, when we restart, our date, our created at is also optional. So you also saw here it complains because the type isn't right. So I just said my message is like ID text and created at. So down here, it basically wants a created at. So we kind of just make it optional. You can also create separate types, which is what the CLI does, to make sure that, okay, the message that a user creates has these properties and the message that I'm getting back has these, right? Because that's always the case.
Yeah, and I guess we call
use
that
a single type here.
those are the like the DAOs, like data access objects. So if you've heard that concept in other programming languages or environments, that's basically what you get. So you have a different message being sent versus the one you return versus one that's a patch. Yeah. So
exactly. So this is all, we can all make this happen. I might do this in a little bit, but maybe when we get to the point of talking about validation, because what's happening here is, yes, we defined our type, but we're not really validating anything. TypeScript types get removed at compile time. They're just here to help us write code and know what's there. It doesn't really do anything validation wise or anything like that for us. But if I restart this now that I made the created at optional, you can see that we're getting the timestamps for when the messages have been created with our response, and then also in our API response. So hooks are basically this idea where you can do data modification, you can populate entities, like say you want to send the user back with the message. You could do that in a hook. You want to do logging, you want to do profiling to figure out how long did a method run. Actually, I can show you that, which is also a good example. So this is a new thing in Feathers. It's called a round hook, and it works very similar. Let's do around everything, around all methods. But the difference is that I also get a next function. So what I can do with the before hook, it just runs and then it goes on to the next one. So I can add another one here that does something else. With an around hook, I can actually do something before, then run everything else, and then do something after. So if I want to do the save the start time, then I want to run everything else. And after it, I want to say, okay, I want to calculate the total time, which is now minus the start time. And let's do context.method as well, which is the method that we're calling. If I run this, you can see this is the problem with having an M1 Mac, that it was so fast you didn't even see it. But if you create a new one from the API, it's going to be a little faster. No, still takes 0 milliseconds. But if your call would take a little bit longer, it would show the actual runtime here. So this is the new hook type where you can basically do more complicated things like that. But all the old ones still work. Excellent. So we have hooks that help us to do things like logging and changing our data and validating things without having to actually change our service. This is even more relevant in Feathers if you're using one of the database services, because the database services implement a bunch of these methods for you already, but often you want to modify things from what they do by default. So you can extend them, but hooks are also a good way to make this a little bit more flexible. Now, we had the question with validation, and this has always been tricky topic for Feathers, because the answer was you basically do it in a hook. It turned out that meant there was a lot of different approaches, and sometimes people just got confused on which one is the best one or which one is the right one. Should you do it with your ORM like Sequelize, or should you use your own validation library, or what library should you use? So one of the new things we built into Feathers 5 is to actually make validation a part of this with the schema module. So again, it's schema. Like everything in Feathers, it's totally optional, but when you generate a new app, it'll ask you if you want to generate schemas with everything. So what schemas do is It's also pluggable, but the first two integrations are using JSON schema. It's a standard. There's a lot of great tooling around it. We can use it to automatically generate OpenAI specifications and all of those things. So it was a pretty good candidate as the first validation format to use. And the one that we integrated, so you can use JSON schema by itself, but we found, and the feedback from people was that JSON schema is a little verbose. You have to write a lot of definition boilerplate. So there's a really cool project called Typebox, which basically makes it a little nicer to write those schemas and schema definitions and to get the types from it. So instead of having to do the type here, we want to say, okay, we want to get a type and validations for our schema. And with Typebox, we can do that with type. So I say const message schema. It's an object that has, we're going to just get the autocomplete here now, right? Oops. So this is how Typebox schema definition looks like. It basically, you say, okay, my message schema is an object. It has an ID that's an optional number. So it's this, it has the text, it's a string, and an optional created at. And then additional flags are basically say, don't add, when somebody tries to put extra nonsense into our data, we're going to throw an error. And then we'll also give it an identifier so that we know what this actually is. So we'll just call it message.
I just want to add really quick, because a lot of people, I think in the chat, were probably more familiar with Zod. Yeah, D. Gramick just asked, is Typebox like Zod? I would say it's like it, but nice that you actually get a JSON schema back, because with Zod, it's purely, it gives you back a validator function, and then it gives you back a TypeScript type. But with Typebox, you get a validator, a TypeScript type, and a JSON schema that can be used in API documentation and in various other places as well. So it's kind of like Zod plus JSON schema.
That's a great point. So over the last year and a half, when we worked on the schema integration, we've been looking into a lot of different libraries like Joy, Yub, Zod, JSON schema, and Typebox. And the thing with Typebox and JSON schema, just plain JSON schema, which you can also do with Feathers, is for the longest time, it wasn't possible to infer the TypeScript types from it. So you have to write your TypeScript types again and your validation schema. And that was the big goal for me, to avoid that we have to write types and schema definition and validations twice, because I've seen so many apps, and there's not even Feathers apps, it's every framework that has that problem, where you have to duplicate your validation and schema definition somewhere, and they almost always go out of sync. So what I wanted to accomplish with this, what we were hoping for, is basically be able to create your schema once in one central place, write once, use everywhere, and then use it in the rest of the application, and which we're hopefully going to get in a little bit on the client as well. So this has been working pretty well. CJ had a good point. If you're using a SQL database at the moment, you still have to create your tables, unfortunately, but hopefully we'll find a solution to that as well.
Yeah, and it's not the end of the world. And over the past couple of days, I've just been messing around with the Prisma integration. And I think in about 4 hours of coding, I had a service adapter that used Prisma instead of Connects. It seemed to work just fine. There's a couple of bugs I need to work out, but I think this is where I don't know if David's talked about it yet, but the community around Feathers is huge, because like Feathers, the library itself doesn't have to create these kinds of adapters. They can be community maintained. So there's currently a Feathers v4 Prisma adapter. It hasn't seen any activity. I didn't know if they were going to upgrade it, so I just thought I would try. So I have a slightly working version of that.
I'm really hoping that there is going to be so this is a new version. It's going to take a little bit for all the plugins that are actively maintained to be upgraded, but and integrations. But I'm looking forward to all the new things that people can make use of here as well. Okay, so we have the schema, and now the cool thing, if we can actually get the type by inferring it from the schema. So you saw that we have a validation, JSON schema validation object, but it also automatically gives us the right TypeScript type. And if I change a property name here, or if I add a new one, it'll automatically be available in my messages in a message service. And then I have to validate it. So I need a AJV is a JSON schema validator. So I'm going to use that from here. And I have to call it with new. So we need a validator for the schema. And then, no, that's not it. Const message validator. I need to get the validator for my typebox schema. So this is the right one. Sorry, Copilot, that was not right. So I'm going to get the validator for the message schema using the AJV validator. All right. And then we can, so remember how I talked about with hooks. So this new schema integration for Feathers is basically just using Feathers hooks under the hood to do the validation and make sure that your types are correct and everything. So this is all, again, not Feather specific. This is Typebox, and this is just AJV. And we register it with a hook, schema hook. So there's a collection of hooks here that we can use instead of the ones that we have down here. Let's remove this one. No, we'll leave it in. So we can basically here, we can say hooks.validate data. So we want to validate the data with the message validator. All right. I think I removed my created add thing, but we'll just restart it and see what happens. All right, so we created a new message. But the cool thing now is, we have a type that's always up to date. And if I go back into my API and try to create nonsense, we get a validation error that says, don't do this.
Awesome.
Excellent. The one other thing I wanted to show about this is, so remember how we added the created add in the hook? We found that very often you have to do things like that. And in bigger applications, people just created all their own hooks to modify the data in different places. And sometimes it got a little chaotic and you didn't know which hook runs at what time and what data are modified. So the other thing that with the schema definitions we added is kind of our version of data resolvers. So what this does is basically do things like adding a created add property, but it can also do much more complicated things. But let's start with the created add. So basically, if I say like message data resolver, we resolve a message and we use the hook context from Feathers. And that's just an empty object. And then that's not it. And then I want to say, okay, this created add method, property, I want to populate with the current date. We have done this before, right? So we just say like date.now. But what this, why this is interesting, so this also gets included as a hook. So down here, we just say like, we validate the data first. This is up to you, by the way. So the CLI creates a recommendation for how to put validations and things like that together, but you can always move it around to what you need. But I can basically say, okay, resolve the data with this message data resolver. And then we're back at what we were before and getting like the created add timestamp here. But what's kind of cool is that instead of having to create a new hook, if I want to do something else, like trim the text, I can just go in here and say, okay, the text, I want the current text here, and then return the current text, but to string. And trim it, the white space at the beginning, at the end. So this, I found, is the resolvers are pretty powerful because you can do a lot of complicated data manipulation just in one spot with one thing. And the other thing that's interesting is, so this is for data. When you create a new service, you can also resolve data when they're coming back from a service. So that was one of the big things that were always tricky in Feathers, because we have the database adapters and we have the services to answer that question on how do I populate related data. And the answer now is you can basically say, all right, if I have, let's say I have a user here, right? So I have a user that's optional and an object, and it has a name. I can actually add this to the results if I say something like this. And then we'll add this down here.
Can you hide the console, the terminal?
Oh, yes, thank you. Sorry. I keep forgetting it after all. So this is, again, just another hook that does resolve the result data. And the problem with this before was in Feathers, you had to look at, you got different kinds of results back. So you have a page object, you have an individual object, like one user, you have a page with users, you have a user array. So you always had to kind of figure out what kind it is and then do your data manipulation. And the Feathers, the new resolvers, it's a pretty small plugin actually, do all of that for you. So if you do this here, I mean, it's not going to be surprising for you that the user is going to be populated. So what we would do in here would basically be you go to the user service, you look up the user, and then you add it. And one of the other nice things for the resolvers was also that we can make sure that the data is always secure. So you have response and real-time data that maybe people shouldn't see the user's password, even if it's hashed. So you can remove that and it'll be safely removed from every response ever, which was sometimes in earlier versions a little bit of a challenge just because there was so many different database integrations. So those are the two big new features, basically the type schema definitions and the resolvers. And as you saw, they're all still database independent. So that was always the goal for Feathers, to not tie you to a specific database. I was going to should we quickly jump into the chat app, like that's generated and the one that you built with the guide, just to show that this is basically what I just showed here and how it looks like?
Yeah, let's do it.
And then I wanted to show how to integrate that in React. So it's just going to be a quick, I might gloss over it, but then we can maybe hopefully answer it in questions. So there's a Feathers chat repository. You can just visit it and try out the chat. There's the quick start example. There's a React integration and a JavaScript only chat, and then the TypeScript backend. So as you might see here, there's a little bit more stuff happening there, but a lot of it is still just the same that we saw before, right? You create your Koa application, you use some middleware. This one also sets up Socket.io for real time. And then this configure, again, is basically wiring. It's also in the docs. You can see a little bit more of how it does this. But this configure basically just wires up all our services for us automatically. So that's what the configure does here. But this is basically the normal Feathers app on the server. And then you can see here that you have the message service files, they're split up. Shared is what's shared between client and server. Schema is the schemas. So that I think looks familiar. You basically have a text created at user ID and user. And here you can see the resolver that I just wanted to show. You basically just populate the user by running this one line of code. And then the class is interesting as well. It's because it extends you have to scroll over, because it extends a database service. So instead of writing our code ourselves, right, this is all done for us already here. So it just talks to a SQL database. Great. We can maybe jump more into details with questions for that. What I wanted to show and what is kind of cool is that I said earlier, the types that we defined in the schemas can be used on the client as well. And this is where Feathers is being really nice about it, because on the client, you can basically just say, let's find the browser. On the client, so this is the browser example. On the client, you can basically just say, initialize the socket, create the Feathers app, and tell it to talk to the server here through the socket. And then you can basically just use the services like we did in our demo example on the server in Node, but on the client in the browser. And what it does then is it talks to our backend at that URL. And then here you can see that we're just listening to new messages and adding them here. So this is still a part of the quick start. And this is kind of Feathers had that client-side integration for a long, long time. So what we ended up doing in version 5 was create a build that exports all the schemas that you define here as a client bundle. And that's what we're using in the React application here. So you basically just install your repo, like your API. You install your API in your React or Vue or React Native or Angular application, create a Socket.io connection, and then just call the create client. And what happens here is I can basically, let's say 1 day. What's 1 day? It's 1,000 times 60 times 60 times 20. That's how many milliseconds are in a day. That sounds about right.
Seems fine.
So one thing we can do now is on the client side in our React app, you basically just say like client service. Here are all my services. I want to get query. I want to query all messages since yesterday. So I can say, here are my properties, right? So I can query for all of those properties if I wanted to. So you could do things like this with the SQL database and get every message that has hello in it. And it's already automatically paginated. So you get 10 items at a time back. But what we want to do here is basically say like, okay, created at, come on, give me my autocomplete. And the created at should be greater than, this is basically everything since the last day, right? So it's kind of neat that we're getting like this. This is all Feathers syntax that's already supported out of the box. So you get a pretty powerful like querying mechanism just out of the box already on your React client. And how it's used in the chat app, we can basically see in some of the components. Let's say, I also realized that they're kind of nicely contained. So they're TSX components, and what you do in your message list component is you get all messages, right? The last 25, and then just render them down here. And for creating a new message, we just call app.service messages create with the text. I'm pretty going to start the chat so that we at least get an idea how it looks like, because I've talked a lot now and haven't even like actually ran the front end. So the chat app that you build with the guide and that the React example is about as well is in the in here. And if I go to localhost 3030 and another thing, authentication plugin has gotten a lot of nice updates. It does have the guide also shows how to log in with GitHub. It's pretty important. So you get a lot of that functionality. Let me see if I can actually do that. Oh, I'm not logged into the incognito window. Let's use this. So I can either just log in or sign up or log in with GitHub, which is probably the kind of thing that we want to see. And then I can send my messages. So this is the chat that you build in the guide, in the Feathers guide, that actually shows all the things that I'm trying to talk about.
So, I mean, Drills just had a question about OAuth providers. Is Feathers still based on top of Grant?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So any OAuth provider that's supported by Grant, you can get working in Feathers.
And Grant, like, you can support like custom ones as well now. Grant is a pretty good tool. It's much nicer than Passport and much more maintained. And some of the good things we added in the new Feathers OAuth is things that are really complicated to do sometimes, like account linking, right? If you want to add multiple accounts to your user account, it also allows to OAuth from different domains. So say you have two different apps, but one API, the new OAuth allows that. As long as you're allowed to make requests from that front-end app, you can do OAuth. So there's a lot of neat little features in there that hopefully we get more time to talk about this year, because that's always been a little bit of a challenge with Feathers, like getting the time to talk about all the cool things that it can do.
Yeah. Drills had a further question. So given, let's say, the Discord user response is provided by default by Feathers, I think it's going to have a similar OAuth integration that you've seen in other places, where you can essentially decide which properties you want to use from the OAuth profile that you get back, and kind of like map those to your user profile. So you have that flexibility.
Yeah, exactly. So this one, the guide shows how to do that with GitHub. So down here, it shows how to basically customize the GitHub strategy with the profile email, because by default and the avatars. So this is using my GitHub avatar, because by default you only get the GitHub ID back, and that might be useful, but not always. So you can always customize the user data that you want to store in the database. Excellent. I think that was everything I wanted to show.
Cool. And
I'm happy to answer questions.
Cool.
I'm sure that there are some.
Yeah, let's jump into questions. So, so this is a question from earlier from the Ali one. It said, I've seen people combining Next.js with Feathers. Can you explain a key strength of such combination?
Yes, I actually can. So the key strength here is a lot of server-side rendering. People are making requests to... Sorry if you can hear it. It's my cat. I knew it was going to come in at one point eventually. Here.
What's their name?
Matthew.
Matthew.
And Matthew is 17 years old, so he gets leeway with being annoying, because you can't teach an old cat new tricks.
Yeah.
All right. So the advantage with Next and Feathers, and I want to write that up at 1.2, is that you don't have to make separate requests to your API, which can be a big overhead, right? If you run your Next app and it makes API HTTP requests, there's the whole HTTP request response cycle overhead there. And what you can do with Feathers is, because it works universally, you can actually just require the Feathers app. Let's use this. You can just require the Feathers app directly into your Next.js application and then use it like any other Feathers app. So you don't have, if you run everything on the same system, you don't have any overhead of making separate HTTP requests.
That's a really good point. I mean, so when I was digging into Next.js, like that's one of the biggest, I guess, flaws. I think there are a lot of community packages that help with it, but like that's what I saw. Like if you define an API endpoint and you want to call that and like get server-side props, you can't. You just have to either like abstract it and duplicate the code. But I see what you're saying with Feathers. Like you literally just get a reference to the service, and now you can call it directly inside of get server side props. And then similarly,
exactly.
Yeah, when it loads on the client, you can just run the client side version of that inside of a mounted
exactly.
hook. So yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Exactly. So because it's so universal and works on both sides, all right. For now. This is the best part about doing things from home. It's having pets run into things.
Yeah.
That the advantage is that you don't have the overhead, and because the app is universally usable, you can use it on the server and the client side, which is actually a pretty unique integration. I don't know if anybody else is doing that way.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but I definitely want to see the kind of integrations that can happen with SvelteKit, because I've been digging more into SvelteKit. So that'll be pretty cool. I don't know if this, just tell me to not, we could skip over this if it's too much pressure, but Jabao is asking, will Dove get out of pre 0.36 today?
This week. I have to finish writing the release post. So what I'm hoping is that if CJ is okay with that and the stream shows up on YouTube, I was going to link it in the release post.
Yeah, that'd be great. This one comes from Codex, who says, the docs only show Express and Koa and Socket.io. Do y'all have plans to support NATS and Redis transports? I actually haven't heard of these.
So this is an interesting question, because that is always been the advantage of Feathers, of being able to swap out the underlying transport. So one that I'm personally very excited about is I have some friends here in town that are working on some really cool open decentralized data projects where you kind of run your app locally on your phone, and then it just synchronizes with everybody else, so you can run your app without a server. And so that's something that I'm would like to work on. But I've done a gRPC integration for a client before. So basically swapping out the Socket.io or Core Express transport for gRPC. I'd love to get more other transports in. There is a prototype for a Cloudflare integration. So it basically lets you use Feathers and Cloudflare workers with that interface, but there's no NATS or Redis yet. I've done some prototyping for Redis with using the message queuing. So basically the idea was to replace the HTTP transport with Redis messages to make the communication more efficient. So what there is a NATS plugin for and a Redis and a RabbitMQ plugin is for scalability. So if you, because of the Feathers service architecture, it's all stateless, it makes it really scalable. And the only thing that you do need to synchronize between, if you say spin up multiple instances, is the messages, right? The created, removed, updated real-time messages, so that every server instance knows about it. And that scaling is done with Redis or a message queue. It's called Feathers Sync.
Yeah, and so I guess I initially, so when they mentioned Redis, I was thinking, oh, like a Redis database adapter, but that's not what they meant at all. There's basically a way of making it so that would be your transport instead of like HTTP. I guess I'm a little fuzzy on that too.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's something I'd really like to look more into, just because there's an opportunity to have a lot of different transports. Like I said, Cloudflare is another one that I think is interesting. And yeah, Redis could be one as well. Like I said, the thing that Redis is working really well for in combination with Feathers is the scaling part.
Yeah, so Pablo asked this question. Does Feathers work with serverless and the edge? I guess the real-time aspect can't work, but the CRUD functionality should work, right?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, we have a Cloudflare worker prototype, which is working really well. In fact, the new ecosystem page is running on the Cloudflare worker. So somebody has written this really awesome page that's not just a long list. It's basically you can organize the plugins by downloads and stars and tags and all of those things. So that's been really cool. And this one is working on Cloudflare workers. And once a day, it just pulls all the star and download and publishing information from NPM and GitHub and updates it here. And it's been a really cool experience. So the Feather CLI app right now needs a long running process. But yes, there's ideas for making it basically replacing the underlying transport with a serverless provider. It's going to be interesting because if you use it the Feathers way, you don't even need to change anything. The tricky part with serverless is always the databases, right? So right now there isn't any specific database integration that kind of works out of the box, but you can always write your own services.
Right. Yeah, and there was a pretty high level question from Dark Ohms who says, "What is a transport?" I think I'll do my best, and then you can chime in. But if you think of the different ways that your data could potentially be accessed, so the one that we're all in web dev is mostly used to are web APIs and HTTP. So you have some backend process and you want to expose that data. So you do it over a REST API or over HTTP. So in this case, the transport is REST or HTTP, and the specific implementation would be like Koa or Express. Another transport is something like real time, so like WebSockets. So take that same data and instead of exposing it over HTTP, expose it over a WebSockets API. So that's one of the ideas in Feathers is you basically, it's transport agnostic. So you write one code base and then plug in a transport adapter, and now you can expose it in various ways.
Yeah, this is one of the things that was really interesting because sometimes people started with a REST API and then realized, oh, I would like to have real time. So just transparently, you can swap it out and it'll just work, which is pretty unique because a lot of other frameworks I've seen, the challenge always is like, if you want to add real time, it's kind of almost an afterthought. Here, send some events. And in Feathers, it's built into the architecture. It's a part of it by default, and you don't have to use it. But if you want to, it's just a flick of a button, one line of code, and you're good to go.
So Shulman had a high-level question. What is your vision for Feathers?
So one of the things, and I talked about that with CJ earlier, is to make sure. I don't believe that every open source framework needs to be $1 billion business, but on the other hand, it needs to. Somebody needs to pay something so that people can keep working on it, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of people that have been using it for big projects that are really successful. So one of the goals for the future is to just make things sustainable. I would like to have 2-3 people that work full time on this, because there were so many things that we never got a chance to talk about, like the client integration and making the development flow easier. And even especially with the new schema stuff, there's so many things that are possible now that I'd just like to be able to develop a little bit more. And that's just not possible with like a side project, which is interesting because, with an open source side project at a certain size, it's not a side project, it's 2 full-time jobs. So a year and a half ago, I kind of went solo for Feathers Consulting, which has been going pretty well. And one of the goals with this version is to have just be able to flesh out a lot of the things that we've never had a chance to talk about more, and just to see where that goes. And for the future, we were talking about transports, I think one of the really interesting things for the future is going to be having things. I don't know if you talked about this on the stream yet. WebAssembly, CJ?
Not much, no.
So it's basically being able to. The goal is to have this concept on how to build an app using the services and hooks, and not have to worry about the underlying setup. And one of the interesting ones, like I said, is being able to just run the entire app on your phone. You don't need a server. If I have a to-do list or a shopping list for myself or, for one other person, I don't need to deploy a super scalable high-end system. I just need a way to synchronize my shopping list with two people. So one of the goals that and things that I'm really interested in is being able to run a lot more of Feathers transport-wise on the edge. And by the edge, I kind of mean on your phone or on whichever device is the most appropriate. And, if it needs to scale, you can always scale out. But the solution of like always having to have a server is not really, that doesn't make that much sense if it's just running, if it could just run. Our phones are super powerful, right? It doesn't need to be always a super high-end, super scalable system. It just needs to have the option to scale to up if it needs to.
I have an answer to this too, but Veritatas asks, what's a good use case for Feathers that is not real time? My answer is literally anything you would have built an API for. So, mainly, since I discovered Feathers, I pretty much reach for it instead of like just bare Express or just bare like Fastify, because it just provides so much, and there's so many like adapters and community packages that you could use if you wanted to. That's my answer to that is anything, anything you build an API for.
Right. And it seems so like, I sometimes feel like, is it arrogant to say that? But no, it is. That's what it's built for. It is built for any API. And I think use case wise, that was part of the problem too, because you get the real time for free. Often people misunderstood that this is for real time only.
Right.
So it's still a little bit of a communication problem of saying you can use this for any API you ever want to build. But if you ever need real time, you get it for free. You don't have to scramble to add real time functionality. And this is tricky because a lot of the things we learned with Feathers and how to do real time and how to make sure events are sent securely through WebSockets, how to do WebSocket authentication is actually quite complicated. It took us years to get it right. And I've seen in a lot of other libraries, or if you just integrated with like a Socket.io thing, the problem is that you might end up writing fairly insecure real-time functionality just because there isn't a lot of good resources and general patterns for how to make it secure and scalable.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like any of the real-time that I've implemented with Feathers, you just get the auth by default. Like it's automatically checking, it integrates with the auth system. It's automatically checking the tokens on request and everything. And when I tried to do it from scratch, initially there was like just a security vulnerability because like I wasn't validating the token on every request. And like, yeah, so I think that's another interesting point is it kind of just works and then there's a lot you don't have to worry about. So
yeah, I think once anybody who has done a bigger real-time project is going to appreciate the infrastructure that's there.
Yeah.
Just because authentication on WebSockets is tricky. Like you got to re-authenticate when it disconnects and make sure that all of that still works. So the channel system is still another thing that I'd like to talk about more because it's doing that in a pretty fast fashion and in a way that's not even WebSocket specific. So anything that has two-way communication can use it in the future.
A quick shout out to Marshall. They've been really helping out in the chat and providing a lot of good context and info. And they have
Marshall's always been making the website, and here I don't know if you've tried it yet, but the dark mode switcher where the moon goes up. So awesome. I have to say I've had so much great help from everybody that has been helping out with this. It's really, really nice. It's not a huge community, but it's an awesome community.
Definitely. I guess on that point, can we point to community resources? Like, is there like a Discord? Is there a spot on the website I can point people to?
Yeah, so Discord is up here with the Discord link. And there's GitHub. So what we did for this version is basically move everything into a monorepo, everything. So all the packages are in there now. The docs are in the same spot. It's been really nice. If anybody ever thinks about starting a new project, make it a monorepo for everything. That's what I do whenever a client comes in and doesn't have a monorepo. Is the first thing that I do just because it's so much easier to have the package, the docs, everything together and be able to test it. There is discussions, GitHub discussions that are used, and Stack Overflow will get a notification too. But discussions, GitHub discussions, issue if it's an actual bug or problem, and Discord are probably the best places.
This question comes from Drills. Can you give a quick talk about the roadmap for 2023?
Yeah, so 2023, we wanted to just add some of the details for how to do more advanced things like API key, two-factor authentication, deployment. So I'm talking to a group that is starting a new deployment service, and we wanted to get a deployment from the command line for your Feathers app and database integration going. So that's going to be hopefully happening sometime soon. And for the general roadmap over the next year, I have to sit down once all of this is out and figure out what are the things we want to tackle and talk about. But some of the things I've been looking at was more Swagger Open API integration will be good. Now that we have schemas, you could technically also integrate GraphQL. I'm curious to see how important that actually still is if you have a typed client, because I think that was the big selling point of it. And the advantage of the Feathers typed client is that there is no communication overhead. So it doesn't have to parse the query language or anything. It just runs on HTTP or sockets. And I've made a WebSocket versus HTTP comparison before. If you care about performance, you get a lot more performance out of WebSockets. If one client makes a lot of requests, it's about 4 times faster. So that is one. And for some of the other things, I have to sit down and actually write it all down. But thank you for asking. That's a good moderator to do it.
All right. Codex has a question. So have you evaluated performance against other frameworks? Can you share your experience about memory and request overhead?
Yeah. So I haven't done benchmarks for the new ones yet, but I think the last benchmarks people have done with Express, it was 2% slower. And with WebSockets, it was 5-6 times faster. So what I'm getting is performance-wise, I think there are two important things. One, if you need performance, use WebSockets. In Feathers, you can do that with a flick of a switch, and you get significant, not just 2 or 5%, but 400% performance boost. So I will make some more comparisons around that. And the other problem too is that most performance problems that I've run into are usually the poor database queries or things like that. So we've really made sure that Feathers itself is as lean and small as possible, and that it has a new router now that's using the Radix tree system, similar to what Fastify does. So that is even faster than Express's standard router, if that is important. But the thing basically is that performance is not as significant as making sure you make a good fast database query or something like that, because a lot of the things that we end up doing in a real app make it orders of magnitude of a difference. So I'm going to add some benchmarks. All I can say is that WebSockets are going to probably be faster than anything else right now, but I'll wanted to compare some of the current V5 with some of the other things for sure.
Shulman asks, how many people work on Feathers with you?
So I think Marshall actually already, he said it doesn't have a couple of people who regularly contribute. So this is the interesting thing that I really enjoyed about this, is that contributing doesn't just mean contributing code. So I'd say, and sometimes even a small code contribution can make a big difference. So I know when people look at the contribution graph, somebody complained, was hey, it's just this one dude, which is true and not true, but that's also true for pretty much every open source project. But now, that the docs and everything is together in the monorepo, we're getting a much better idea on who is contributing. So there was probably at least 2-3 dozen people that have been helping out with trying out the pre-releases, fixing documentation things, making the website, the ecosystem overview and answering questions in the Discord. So it's kind of almost hard to say, but it's been really nice. And the Vue channel, the Vue.js channel, is super active because there's a really good Vue.js integration that Marshall is working on happening. So there's so many different things going on. It's really hard to say, but I would probably say like 35 people that are actively participating and contributing, and then many more that just sometimes come in with a question or sometimes come in with a drive-by pull request that's pretty awesome. I mean, like, oh, you fixed this problem, which is excellent when people run into a problem and then also at the same time submit a pull request. Here's a test and a fix for the problem that I ran into. It's really nice to see that in open source.
Yeah, and I mean, I made a PR last night that fixed the generator.
Yes,
so.
yes, which was fantastic. And you know that was interesting too, because your PR prompted me to. I knew there was a blind spot in the CI system, and the lesson learned is whatever you don't test is going to break at one point. Yeah. Always. I knew there was a blind spot in the CI system that wasn't testing that. So when you made the PR and fixed it, I made a updated CI system and said, need to run tests for this.
Yeah.
And then I made sure the test broke in my version, and then I merged yours, and then it was fixed. So nice. It was great.
I always think about that because a lot of times if I make an open source contribution, I try to include like a test for it, but I didn't even think about it last night. I was like, let me just fix this really quick.
Yeah, I think it would have been tricky, like just on how the test is set up. But this is pretty cool because the generator and the CLI, I didn't even get to talk about, but their brand, like totally rewritten, much more solid and flexible in what they can do, and really fast too. There's a tool for it that we kind of ended up writing ourselves that I get to talk about 1.2, but it's also being tested in the monorepo with all the current code. So this is something that it was tricky to do before, to say, I want to test the generator. I want to make sure that all my prompts work. I want to test all the current packages if I break anything. And I want to test the docs and make sure that they still build. So that was really cool having this all together.
This question comes from Steve out of jobs. What is the preferred schema library, Typebox or JSON schema? Why do you include two to choose from?
So we started with JSON schema and got a lot of feedback that was not super positive, just because it's really verbose. And Fratzinger, who's I think in the chat too, came in and said, hey, check this out. I made Typebox integration. Let's give that a try. And people were really happy with the Typebox integration. So we kind of ended up making that the default, just because it's a lot more, you still get a JSON schema and the TypeScript types, but it's a lot more concise than JSON schema, where you have to write a lot of boilerplate to define your types. So I guess JSON schema is kind of historical, but it's kind of also helpful because if you have a JSON schema already, you can throw them into your Feathers app and it'll just work and you get the types for it. So for a client, I'm writing a project that doesn't use Feathers on the server. It just uses Feathers on the client, and they give us their open API spec. And then we're building out a typed Feathers client for it, which has been really cool to do. So you don't even have to use Feathers on the server. You can just use it on the client as your API SDK state management library. And it's pretty powerful to have those types available.
Also, it's like you're going in reverse because like they defined the API and schema, and now you can use that schema to inform the Feathers app that you're building.
So it's only a front-end app, right? And what it does is it takes the open API spec and creates the types for it, and then creates services based on the open API endpoints that talk to it. So it's been a neat project just to do a totally client-side Feathers SDK app.
Lizo Lay says, how do you use Socket.io on the client side? Is there a package for that?
Yeah, so that was quickly what I wanted to show with the client. So the client package is basically Feathers and a Socket.io client package. And then you just connect to the socket, you create the Feathers app, and the Socket.io client package essentially sets up all the communication with the Feather services on the server. So you get the same setup pretty much as we would on a server, but instead of talking to a database, we're just talking to the socket services. So what the Socket.io package does internally is it just creates services that use Socket.io to talk to the backend. So that's usually why we recommend using Feathers on the client, just because it has a lot of like neat features, including authentication and a lot of those things. But you can always still talk to the endpoint directly. So with Socket.io, there's documentation here, how to make your socket calls and how they look like and what service they call. And for the REST endpoint, you can also use the Feathers client. So instead of Socket.io, you just use the Feathers REST client services. But you can also just use the API directly. But you'd be like giving away quite a bit if you use the API directly, because the client gives you hooks, and you can do client-side validation, you can do caching, which is really cool. People have built client-side cache packages where if a request is made again, it'll just come back right away. Somebody has built a React library that uses hooks to create real-time data streams. So you basically have a React hook that gives you the real-time message data stream. Whenever a message changes or gets added or deleted, the stream updates and your React component that displays it re-renders.
This question comes from Pond Garden. Is there a way to get a connection object when a client emits an event against a service? For instance, they emit a join, but I need a connection object to join the user to a particular channel. User may have multiple connections, but not want them all to join on any specific joined request.
It might be a little bit tricky to like dive into that, but you can get the connection. It's in the API. So if it's not in the API docs, then please people like ask questions, because then we can update the API docs. But the connection you get with a request is in the parameters. So remember how when we created the Feather services, we did the create with data and defined with nothing. You can still pass additional parameters. So things that you get is like the query or the user that's logged in or the headers, and it also has the connection. Cool. So you can do a lot with that and with the real-time channel system, which would probably need a separate stream to dive into that.
Yeah, I would say in my experience, the channels aspect was definitely the hardest to wrap my mind around, because like it's not exactly like Socket.io in that
it's similar.
Yeah, but the way you have to think about the like each request, whereas like every request coming through, you decide, okay, what service is this targeting? Is the user auth? Do they have a specific role? And then if they do, we can put them in this channel to receive those events. If not, then they don't get in that channel. I think that's probably one of the trickiest parts of Feathers, at least in my experience.
I agree. And that's part on the roadmap for actually being able to talk about those things more and just explain them a little bit more in detail and the reasoning behind it. Just because the channel system, part of the reason why it works the way it does is to make it performant, like predictably performant, because before the early version had to go through every connected client at every event and figure out what to do with it, which turned out to be kind of slow if you have, a couple of thousand users connected. So this one was one of the goals, but you're right. It is a kind of turning it in your head thing that's happening there, because you think about channels only on the server, and the client never really has to worry about their channels, because they basically just get the updates that they should receive.
Right. And I think that's also kind of the answer to Pond Garden's question. It's like, the client wouldn't request to join. They just get joined on the back end if they satisfy a certain requirement, that they're a certain kind of user or they're calling a certain service. So
exactly.
This one comes from Steve out of Jobs again. Are there a significant amount of devs in the community using Feathers with Angular? Seeing at what has been done with Feathers Vuex, I would really love to see something with Angular as well.
That I can say. It's sometimes really difficult with open source to get an idea of what the actual usage levels are, because it either, when you don't hear about it much, it either means nobody's using it or everybody who's using it doesn't have any problems. So I had it more than once that something broke, and I heard from half a dozen people or a dozen people, hey, this is broken. I'm using it with this. And I was like, I had no idea that that's the thing. So what there is, though, is Feathers RxJS. There's an RxJS integration, which I know, Feathers Reactive, that's what it was, which basically creates observable RxJS streams out of Feather services. So this will be updated to version 5 as well, but it kind of still works because the API is the same. But you can essentially create observable streams that you can subscribe to, and I believe Angular still plays well with that in RxJS.
Let's see, Michiel, it's an unrelated question, but Michiel is asking, would this work to implement webhooks in a project? And I have just my own example of that. Like, essentially, I guess it's a form of webhooks. So I have a Patreon, and when someone becomes a patron, that actually Patreon will send an API request to my backend server to let my backend server know that I have a new patron. And I've actually implemented that with Feathers. So essentially, like anything you could have done with just a plain old like Express API or REST, you can do with Feathers as well. Let me show that specific thing, because we didn't exactly touch on this either when David was showing examples, because he showed kind of the idea of CRUD, like you're operating on an array of data, which is like the most common thing, but there are also scenarios where you kind of just need an endpoint for something to hit. You'll also see my layout in here. So, I mean, most of this code was written 2 years ago, and I'm like gradually adding onto it. I'm very likely going to just rewrite this code base from scratch with V5 instead of migrating, just because it wasn't TypeScript. But regardless, I break my services down into folders, and then the specific folder can have specific functions, and then service is the actual Feather service itself. But this right here has a create route. So this is the post route that the Patreon backend would hit whenever I get a new patron. But I can do all of the things like I would inside of like a regular Express route, right? So I'm validating that the post request coming in has the right signature, and then at a certain point, what am I doing? Yeah, and actually this is just like an in-memory service, because I'm not actually keeping all of the patrons in a database. When the API spins up, it requests all the patrons from the API, and then anytime a new patron comes in, I just push it into an array. So all of that to say, like, this is an example of a Feather service that doesn't even have like a database backend. It can be called by other types of clients that expect your backend to just be like a REST API as well. Yeah, BeardUp has a question from earlier. Are there any breaking changes in Feathers V5?
Yeah, so we always been trying to make it as compatible as possible, but there were breaking changes. But it's basically, so there's two things to it, two sides. One is the breaking changes are documented in a migration guide. So there's TypeScript changes, which unfortunately are always breaking because you can't do type changes that are backwards compatible. So that since there was so many TypeScript changes, there will be breaking changes. And then there are a couple of really legacy things that were just supported because of Express 3 and things like that got removed, and the old socket format. The other breaking changes are basically the breaking changes for the libraries that Feathers relies on, like Socket.io and Grand. Then, so there's a couple of breaking changes, but a lot of them were from the people that migrated, I heard, were manageable and for good reasons. So one of the reasons, like configuration environment variables, were it kind of seemed like a good idea at the time, but it turned out not to be, to just substitute variable names with environment variables. So that has been dropped, and it's just using node config now. So there's a couple of things like that. And then it used to support Primus internally, which is like a WebSocket abstraction. but it turned out that it wasn't used enough to warrant maintaining two separate packages. So 98% were using Socket.io and 2% of people were using that. And I'd rather have a like bare bones core WebSocket at one point. So part of the roadmap is basically adding more transports to be a little bit more flexible with that. So there are breaking changes. They're in the migration guide. The other thing is that the generated app right now will look quite different, like not quite different, but different enough. So I've seen some people that migrated just by regenerating their services, but we are trying to see how much of a migration path there's going to be for version 4 in the next 2-3 months, just to make it a little bit easier.
Codex has a question. You mentioned having a few hires and even talked about consulting. Do you see yourself expanding anytime soon?
Yes. And part of the goal is basically looking at being able to bundle up some of the things that I've done for Feathers Consulting, integrating advanced authentication providers or third-party services that hopefully we can package up to make it available through the CLI to purchase. So that's one of the things that I'm hoping will at least make things a little bit more sustainable and allow us to expand a little bit more on writing about things and implementing some more of the cool open source features that we've been wanting to do but never could because there wasn't enough time. So there's going to be a couple of extra packages hopefully soon that will help you with some of the more advanced stuff, while all the existing Feathers things that have been available open source are going to stay that way. I'm always happy to answer more questions. Like if you want to join the Discord and make things in the future, maybe let's do 2 more and then.
That's a good one. What was the most difficult moment during Feathers 5 development other than the pandemic?
During Feathers 5, there was this moment a couple of months ago where I was just sitting down and there was so many things still to do and the list just got longer and people meant well and were trying things. And sometimes somebody comes in and says, this looks terrible. Oh, the previous version looks so much better. Just having that kind of point where was wondering what I'm even doing, but I think everybody has that at one point. So the interesting part about a lot of that feedback often is that people have some specific notion or idea of how things should work. And then just often it's just a documentation problem. And asking people that are really frustrated with something or really don't like what's happening helps a lot to just improve the documentation, explain where things are coming from and why they are the way they are. It's just sometimes tricky with developers when you have worked on something for a long time and somebody comes in and says, this is terrible. It's hard to not take that personally, but I think we've gotten pretty good at just being able to still get useful feedback out of when it happens, which is pretty nice because people do actually mean well at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think it's just way too easy to type a mean comment without thinking about it, like in a GitHub issue or something like that, to not realize there's real people on the other side of this. So
yeah. All
right, let me find one more question and then we can get out of here. I guess Fratzinger probably has the best one. What are the next steps? So what can we look forward to for V5 in terms of the release or anything like that?
Yeah, so I want to write the release post. It's kind of complicated because I don't know what to put in there with there's a what's new page in the guide, what's new guide as well, and it's gotten really long. And I'm trying to condense a blog post out of it that explains the new version pretty well, especially for, the many people that have never heard about Feathers, which has always been a big challenge. The JS surveys frequently, while it was still in there, were not very, didn't say a lot in regards to feathers, because 95% of all people have never heard about it. So part of the next steps is to talk about things and show off a lot of the cool stuff that's been happening and that can be done with all of this. So I'm excited to share some of that, and we'll see what comes out of the collaborations and some of the more advanced helping with advanced topics and things like that. So I'm looking forward to this year. It's gonna be interesting. But yes, first release post, and then hopefully keeping a more regular cadence of being able to talk about a lot of the things that, even we touched on only briefly today.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, David. And thanks everyone for showing up. Definitely go check out Feathers on GitHub, on Twitter. We have that chat command. Go try out Feathers right now. Just generate the app in your terminal.
Yes.
Give it a try.
If you have any problems, please don't hesitate to hop in the Discord or send a message or something. That's what always helps.
Awesome.
All questions are good questions.
So yeah, David, if you want to stick around after I end the stream, we can just chat for a couple more minutes. But that's it. Thank you everybody for hanging out. Wherever you are in the world, have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, or night. And until next time, here's this.